Welcome. My name is Amy McDonald, the Director of City Space. Welcome to our in-person audience and our much bigger virtual audience that is out there. All of our programs are hybrid going forward, so people can watch in the comfort of their own homes or wherever they are. I do look forward to when we're all more comfortable to gather in person and this room is more full. Tonight is our series, is the Arts and Culture edition to This Changes Everything, our series which is examining all the ways the pandemic has changed our society and our lives. And we could not have a better panel than what we have tonight. I'd like to introduce Ty Burr, the longtime film critic for the Boston Globe. He now writes Ty Burr's Watch List on Substack. Jill Medvedow, the longtime director of the Institute of Contemporary Art, and Diane Paulus, our renowned artistic director of the American Repertory Theater. We have our own Paris Alston, host of Consider This at WBUR, moderating tonight's conversation. Take it away, Paris.
Well, hello. Good evening. I know we are a small but mighty crowd. It is so wonderful to have you all in the building with us this evening, so we really appreciate it. And to all of you online who are tuning in, we really appreciate that as well. We know that you're with us here in spirit, and like Amy said, we'll look forward to when you feel comfortable coming back in. And thank you to our lovely panelists for being here. It's so nice to see your faces and be here with you in the flesh. So I want to start, everybody asks this question, right? It's been 22 months. We're all trying to figure out what exactly has happened to us and to this world that we're living in over that time. But how would you say the pandemic has changed what you do in the art space the most? And I'll start with you, Ty.
Well, the pandemic has changed the movie business and the movie exhibition business in ways that were already happening. With the rise of streaming platforms, but it has just fueled it. It's just turned it way up to to full. And how that's changed how I have done things. Well, for one thing, when the pandemic kicked in, there were no more movies in theaters to review. The theaters shut down, and intriguingly, I didn't miss a beat. It was like stepping off the Titanic into the rowboat. There were plenty of movies streaming on Netflix and Amazon premieres. And while the major studios didn't release, they put all of their big movies on ice until 2021 and 2022. The independent art houses and the independent distributors, like the Coolidge, like the Brattle, like the Somerville, and independent distributors like Neon and A24, they made their movies available in virtual screenings. So with the local theaters getting a piece of the pie. So there was plenty of content out there. And in fact, I was covering just as many movies and reviewing just as many movies as before, just not the major studio releases. And that reflected a sea change that was already going on with people tending to watch more at home for all the variety of reasons that we know. So not much changed with what I do, while everything was changing in the film industry.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Jill, what about you?
Well, I wouldn't characterize it just as the pandemic, because of course in the same period of time we had reckoning with racism, and so I see both of those things really dominating the last 20 months now, I guess. But also we were trying to keep an institution open when we could, so the ICA closed, it opened, it closed again, and it reopened. So everything changed, really. One is we had to learn how to do that. I will tell you, the first time closing down a museum was very tough. We had no idea how to do that, and still keep our art and our building and our staff on site safe. And then we had to learn how to reopen it with all the various safety protocols and procedures, and then it was much easier the second time. At the same time, we identified 4 key constituencies that we wanted to really focus on. And they were our staff, artists, our neighbors in East Boston, and our teens. And so we've really spent the last 20 months working with these 4 different groups in a variety of ways to keep everybody safe, to keep everybody employed, to be able to make sure artists had some sources of income. Our theater are closed, but our galleries reopened to different degrees of attendance. And we just recently reopened our theater for live performance. But I think there's a huge amount to unpack there in kind of both dimensions.
Diane?
So it's a huge question. I appreciate what Jill said about thinking about what has changed, because it feels like so much has changed. I think for the live theater, maybe compared to film and even galleries, the presence of audience in theater is central to what we do. And that experience of being collectively in a shared space is the core, the definition of what makes theater. So it was a traumatic disruption for a long time. And there were, again, these questions of how do we engage with our staff, how do we prioritize our artists, how does the work continue, how do you continue to develop work, how do we actually use the moment to reach new audience through the digital platform. But it was all new. Hearing you say that, I mean, I think we forget how, I have some colleagues in the house here tonight, and those early days of just, we are a theater company all of a sudden becoming a digital entity, which we were doing some digital work and capture, but it really wasn't what we did as an organization. So having to pivot that intensely and quickly was very hard. And all the rethinking about who we are as an institution, taking the time to assess our values, to center a different way of thinking around workplace culture and public health as animating ideas. I wouldn't have traded this time for that. You know, yes, I actually don't believe in the silver linings of the pandemic, but
they can be hard to find, especially 22 months in.
Right, but the things that happened over this time were transformative, I think, not just change, but transformative. But what was hard is we weren't able as a theater to do what we do as a core. So we were in Zoom. I mean, I feel like I never worked harder than I did in the pandemic. And we weren't doing live theater. So it was just a lot of Zoom meetings and, you know, conversations and figuring out how to carry on as a cultural institution in the middle of this major disruption.
Yeah. So
you weren't getting the energy back from that live event. So now that we are back and we're doing live theater, I think we just had our first preview of a new musical last night, and we had a sold-out theater, and there's nothing that replaces that feeling of when an audience comes out together. And I think in this time, the people who are coming to the theater, and thank you, everyone who's coming to the theater, people really want to be there. People really want to be there. I think we're going to look back at this period and say, oh, that was that period of event theater, because everybody, whether it's, you know, at the ART, I'm sure at your space, you know, the ways I've experienced it with the two shows that we have on Broadway, the audiences are there because they're consciously choosing to be there in a way they never have before. So it's being put into relief, really, what that live experience is and how much we need it, I think, as humans.
Yeah, definitely. And Jill, I know you want to pick up off that.
Well, I would say what I've been saying is that it has shown us how museums matter. I would definitely expand that to the arts. But it is the same thing that we see with audiences at the ICA, in the galleries as well as in the theater. People want a shared and collective experience. I think people want meaning. We are all looking for ways to understand what's happening to us. It's been a very, very confusing time of disruption. There's huge anxiety and stress. I know the constant pivoting, I hear this from so many people. It's exhausting. And there's so much uncertainty and loss. There's just been trauma and loss individually, as a city, as a country, And I think that our artists are helping us understand that, helping us connect to ourselves and to one another. So what I think, and I'm with you actually, I'm not a big silver linings person. I would have rather not had the pandemic or the murders. I mean, but it is real, what we're going through, and our ability, I think, as leaders to steer our institutions, to care for our communities of staff, our communities of artists, our communities of young people and visitors, is actually strengthening bonds. And that is one thing I feel really strongly about.
What I would extend that to the movie experience, of course, movies are made elsewhere. You can watch them anywhere. There's no live component, except the experience is a live component. And that's what people have been missing, what I've been missing. And, ironically, we've been able to just watch everything at home. So you can kind of forget about that. But I know that as people have been trickling back into the theater, it's so clear that we've missed that experience. And there's nothing like a packed theater, whether it's a play or a movie. Everybody's experienced that thing at the same time and just welded into this one mass of emotion. I saw it a little bit when Dune hit and a lot of people went to the theaters. You are going to see it when West Side Story opens on Friday. It's a very, very successful, very emotional remake. And I think I'll be very, it's dovetailing with Omicron, unfortunately. And there have been, I was mentioning to you, there's this research study that talks about how people are going back to the theaters. So that might make a dent in it, but I think in a perfect world, that would be the kind of movie where people would come back together and want to come back together to experience it in a theater. The problem is there's so many other things to watch at home.
Yeah.
For a second, I thought Omicron was a movie.
Yes, it's the next Transformers
It could be
film.
one. It might be in like
and
30 years. Right.
So it's Omicron.
Compete with West Side Story that weekend.
Transformers 4, The Rise of
Yeah.
I was
Omicron.
like, oh yeah, Omicron.
what
I was like in denial about Omicron. Yes.
So Ty, well, and I want to remind those who are watching online that you can submit questions for our panel here. You may also be able to do that. You can also do that in the audience if you're here with us in person. So Ty, we have a comment from someone who's saying, I really miss going to the movies.
Right.
Why can't all movie theaters have a policy to only allow vaccinated people to attend with masks?
It's a very, very good question. And because the issue is so politicized and because the major chains don't want to wade into a politicized area, they're just not addressing the issue. A number of independent theaters are. And that research study that I was mentioning to you actually asked if theaters had a vaccine mandate, would you be more inclined to go? And people pretty much overall said yes. So that's something that I hope gets heard by the AMCs, by the Regals, by the showcases. And like I said, it's already, I'm not sure if it's actually being implemented by the Coolidges and the Brattles, but they're very, very rigorous about it. I think that if they implemented that, it would help. But unfortunately, they want to stay above what they see as a political fray, which I think is a shame.
I've been to the movies twice in this pandemic, and the first time I went back was to see The Werewolf Within, of all movies.
Okay.
It was not my choice. I was with a group. I was like, okay, fine. And it was very interesting, and it was at the Coolidge, and it was packed. Everyone was masked, but it was packed, and there was like popcorn. It was. We were laughing. I was like, oh, this is really fun. And then the second time I went to see Dune, actually, with my brothers, and it was not the same dynamic experience. I think just because that movie is so heavy, I was like, oh my God, I can't do this. But I almost wonder, like, oh, well, had it been packed, would this be different for me? That kind of thing. But what have you been missing about being able to consume? And I don't know if you've been back to the movie theater, but what are we missing by being able to be in that space altogether?
I've been to press screenings, which are generally pretty sparse. I've been to one what they call a promotional screening, so the theater was packed, and that was in fact Dune, and that was palpable. I mean, and those were people who really wanted to see that movie. It was an early screening, so they were pumped, and it was a vocal crowd. But also being in a theater with a good sound system and good projection.
That was my favorite part of the movie.
Right. I've subsequently seen it on TV. It's fine. It's great, but the theater experience, especially, I don't know if you know, that soundtrack kind of operates at a sub-basement frequency, and you really need that in a theater. The question is the juggling, what you feel comfortable with.
And it's interesting because you had also mentioned that you can just watch stuff at home.
Yeah.
So another movie experience I've had recently was King Richard came out, and I remember this was when I was home for Thanksgiving. My brother was like, "Oh, we should go see King Richard," and I was like, "Well, it's on HBO Max. We can just watch it at home." Right? And you and I had this conversation a few years ago when we were talking about Roma.
Yes.
And about how you can stream Roma on Netflix, but it's so much better when you go to, for certain movies, it's just better to be in the theater. And then for certain ones, it's also better at home because, like, my family and I were making all these, like, we're just funny and quirky, but we were like all talking throughout the whole King Richard movie, which probably wouldn't have been
It's
pleasant
a different
in the theater.
experience and vastly different from the theater. I mean, still you go to movies these days. If you go to movie theaters, people will be talking, people will be looking at their phones. Nobody does that in the theater, I hope, or you smack them on the back of the head.
Yeah.
But at home when you're watching, you got to walk the dog, the phone is ringing, there's so many distractions. It's not the same experience at all. And I imagine that Zoom theater was not the same experience remotely.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit more about that, Diane. What was Zoom theater like?
Oh, really? We're going to talk about Zoom. Okay.
She's like, I thought we were done with Zoom.
No. I just want to say one thing. Oscar Eustace, who is the artistic director of the Public Theater, once said, and it always stayed with me, that when you go to the movies, this is pre-pandemic, and it's an empty movie theater, you'd be like, psych. Yeah. No one's going to be standing in front of me. I can spread out, and so if there's 6 people in an empty movie theater, you're not. I mean, maybe that was just me, but that resonated with me. But if you went to a theater show and there were only 6 people in the large, you'd be like, this is a problem. What's wrong with the show, right? So there's something about the energy of an audience that, I know that the presence of audience actually impacts your experience. There's studies on that your experience of a show is actually defined by the audience, not just the performers. So I think that's what you missed on Zoom Theater. You had actors doing wonderful work, being creative in their kitchens, in their living rooms. We did a production, This Is Who I Am, which was across 5 different theaters, and it was digitally streamed live. There were so many variations. There were live things, pre-taped things, where actors were creative, that writers were generating work. But the piece that was missing was the experience of being in community, in the presence of it. And part of that, for me, which is maybe true for movies and museums, is the ritual of the arts.
Yes.
Right? Because there's a ritual for us as human beings of moving together through time and space. It's a human need, and a human need to be in the presence of something larger than yourself. That's why, we go to church and we look at amazing stained glass windows, or we love to be on a mountaintop and look at a vista, right? That spectacle. But there's these human needs which we do in the theater, in the arts. Right? That's when you go to a gallery and you see a painting, and just the awe of that and the environment of it and people's attention. I think fellow other observers' attention affects you. So I think it's that sometimes we think about theater or art as just the artist's work, but it's really the ritual experience as a society of why we need this.
And it's about the energy that is created between people. It is a force field that surrounds great works of art or great productions.
Vibrations.
Right.
It is vibrations, exactly, and that's missing on Zoom.
Right.
Yes.
That frontal, flat experience does not have that, so it served many purposes, and Lord knows, I was grateful for it. I mean, it allowed us to work and stay connected to our loved ones and our friends, but it sucks the energy out. And being live gives you energy, generates energy,
Right.
creates the vibration.
You use the word ritual, which I think is perfect, and I've always thought of theater as an outgrowth of, it goes back to the campfire and people dancing around and putting on shows around the campfire, in prehistoric times. And the theater is an outgrowth of that, and movies are an outgrowth of that, and even TV is a further outgrowth of that, and the further out you go, the further it gets from that energy of the audience being there. And with film and streaming TV, I fear that the genie's out of the bottle and that people aren't going back. And I have no idea what's going to happen in the next 10 to 20 years as far as theatrical movie presentation. I think the big studio franchise, intellectual property, behemoth, special effects things will still bring people to the theaters. Everything else, the dramas, the comedies, the romances, the challenging projects will not be in movie theaters, which makes me very sad. Well, they'll be in churches of cinema, like the Coolidge and the Brattle, and they will have a dedicated audience, and that's already happened. Those are two separate audiences. Those are two separate industries, really. The mainstream movie industry and the art film industry. They're completely separate modes of production, distribution, and exhibition.
Yeah.
And I just see that as getting wider. And then you throw in streaming TV, and that's, and Netflix and Amazon, and who knows what's happening.
Yeah, there's a little bit of that. Yeah, I mean, there's the ritual, but there's also this really unique thing, this unique tangible thing that is sort of intangible to explain, but you lose it, right?
Yes.
When there's not that novelty of going to experience.
Right.
And one thing I think about, so again, my family, because they came up over the summer and we went to the Virgil Abloh exhibit, which of course now we're all like, oh my God, we're so glad we went because he's passed away. And like we had this, and I have a brother who's a huge sneakerhead, and it was a really important moment for us to all share that together, right? And also I just love the ICA and think it's just really cool, fascinating museum. And and I don't know that we would have had that experience had we not been able to go to that exhibit.
I mean, Virgil, it's a sad moment at the ICA. 'Cause he worked with almost everybody in the museum. And so we've all been personally touched and feeling the loss. And he was an incredibly generous man in terms of his time and his commitment to the next generation and to kind of rising up, which makes some sense now in retrospect, a little bit of that. But people, as you saw, flocked to the ICA. That could not have happened virtually. That was not a Zoomable experience.
Not at all.
No.
Yeah.
Even though he himself creates films as part of his art to be seen, online as well as in the museum setting, but to be able to put it all together, I mean, one of the things museums do that's quite different from a commercial gallery is you get to see a trajectory of an artist's work. And so you get to take that thread and carry it through and go from room to room or look back and have a sight line that's like, oh, wow, he was doing this in the very beginning of his career, and now I see, this, the role of music, or for Virgil, or the community of skateboarding. Not even the skateboards necessarily, but how that signified community for him. And then as you move forward, you get to make those connections. That's a physical narrative experience. And many of the best exhibitions create that narrative. And that is, you're physically moving through space. I mean, that was an important show. It is still kind of stunning that it was just there. Now we're here.
It is, definitely. And Jill, just a note to you, if you
Oh,
could
the
adjust
scarf.
your scarf for
Okay.
us, please. It's just rub it. It's a beautiful scarf.
You know what?
Beautiful
Take it off. Okay, there we go.
There we go. And just a reminder to everyone who's here and everyone who's watching that you can submit questions to us. We would love to hear from you all. And Jill, you talked about how many people flocked right to the Virgil Abloh exhibit because he is this huge figure, and his legacy is going to be with us forever, right? Did having the virtual experience, and this is for you as well, Diane, did that open your spaces up to a new audience? And maybe this would have happened without virtual or not, but...
Well, actually, we had a virtual conversation between Virgil and another artist whose exhibition we presented at the ICA named Sterling Ruby. And it was interesting because Virgil was coming from fashion, moving into the arts. Sterling was smack in the art world, moving into fashion. They knew each other, liked each other, and wanted to have this conversation. That had, I think we had 6,000 people from around the world who participated in this online, who tuned into this online conversation. Now, most of them obviously didn't fly to Boston to see the exhibition, but I found throughout the last period of time that we saw our audiences grow because of the ability to present things online. And that's good. That's really important. And we're trying to figure out, I don't have the answer here, how to maintain all that, maintain this constant virtual production, at the same time as go back to producing exhibitions that, or performances that function within a space, and to understand the ICA. And I say this is, to me, one of the biggest learnings of the last period of time, that we've always seen ourselves as a platform for creation. Mm-hmm. But increasingly, I see that making sure that we are a platform, or a friend of mine calls it a container, for the creation of works being created in our own community, and making sure we are balancing these different communities that we present in our space. And how to do all of that is challenging.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And Diane, what about, have you seen a different audience come to the ART?
I think what was striking about the digital platform is the international reach, and combined with the fact that people don't have to get on a plane. That in terms of a regenerative practice was so illuminating. And so we saw that not just in terms of audience tuning into our offerings from all over the world, but also artists being able to participate from all over the world, right? Because everybody was in different places. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people had left New York, had gone home, had moved out of the city. The opportunity to continue to generate work and create work. So yes, audience, but also reaching an artist community. Mm-hmm. So that idea of the digital technical reach is really powerful, and the idea of access, and how that opened up opportunities for new folks to be introduced to ART. But it's really hard. When you said the virtual production, I was like, oh yeah, that virtual production. It's a whole other institution. It's very hard. And coming out of the pandemic to producing live theater, that is taking everything plus just to do that mindfully and intentionally, with all the learnings from the pandemic, and to center public health and wellness. So I think that's where we're leaning. But there are other learnings that actually rub off, like the fact that we don't do any printed materials anymore, which is completely changed. And we had experimented with it with certain productions, but overnight, no programs, no guides. It's just all digital, and so the digital collateral is so much more exciting because it can be print, it can be articles, it can be letters, it can be videos that can be shared educationally. So I think that the idea of the digital access is, for us in the theater, it's not just, is the show live or is it digital? It's everything around it, all the engagement with it can reach and deepen and spread its wings in a way. That's a big learning.
Jill?
I'm still formulating this in my own mind, but I think one of the takeaways, which speaks to how much we're all doing now, right? Because our work has quadrupled, I would say.
Yeah.
Like you, I've never worked harder.
Yeah.
But I am been thinking about the impact of the federal relief funding and how critical it's been, certainly to the ICA and to almost every arts organization that I know in the last 20 months. And what would it look like if we actually had federal funding, not in the midst of a pandemic, but we actually had federal funding of some significance that let us have this kind of impact, both internally with our staffs and externally with our audiences, so we could continue to do what we're doing and be supported for it. And that, to me, is one of the big takeaways from this pandemic. And it's a fraction of the federal, it's a practically invisible fraction of the federal budget, or the state, or the city. But I think that to be financially supported, since all of this takes financial resources, to be able to maintain this level of impact, like I love what you're doing with public health and, the Chan School. We have been providing fresh fruit, vegetables, dairy, and commissioning artists to make family art kits in East Boston, where our watershed venue is. We've fed probably close to 50,000 people since April 2020. That's part of how we have understood what it meant to be a community resource in the East Boston neighborhood when we couldn't open our watershed in 2020 because it wasn't safe, and having deep relationships with our partner organizations there who do all the heavy lifting. But we should be supported to maintain this stance, to live these values. And I've just been really struck by how different our ecosystem would look if there was public support for the arts.
So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. That's an important point. We're going to come back to that. But I do want to get in an audience question. And Jill, you had mentioned earlier about how it wasn't just the pandemic that we have been facing in this time. It's also been our racial reckoning, or awakening, as some would call it, or recognition even. And we have a question from an audience member who's asking, considering the intersectional experience of the pandemic and this reckoning, what changes have you seen in the arts as we reopen? And Ty, I guess this could also go for maybe, what have you been seeing in the film and theater space with welcoming audiences in and starting to have those conversations through something that we all know and love, which is movies?
Right. You first.
Okay. Well, what I've seen, I think, more than anything, is recognition that our external stances need to be aligned with our internal stances, and that for many of us there was a gap. So I'd say that is one thing.
And what do you mean by a gap?
The ICA, for example, has spent a lot of effort and time and thinking about ensuring that, thinking deeply about whose stories are told and who gets to tell them, whether it's on our walls or on our stage, about investing lots and lots of resources into Boston teenagers, and mentoring the next generation, fighting for paid internships in art museums. So there's a long history at the ICA of caring about this, of living those values. But what I think is that the issues of the workplace and the actual work, the labor of our staff from top to bottom did not get enough of the same attention, is what I would say. And so we have been changing that, addressing it, paying for it, and doing more and planning it more and more and more. So embedding equity and a sense of belonging throughout the institution, from governance to staff to visitors to artists, has been central to our work. What hasn't changed is our commitment to really artists of just so many different backgrounds, race, gender, sexuality. The ICA, I think the strongest works being made right now are really grappling with issues of intersectionality and identity, and the issue of representation and figurative art, which has been kind of not the prevalent work on view in the art world writ large. What you see now in contemporary art is a big focus on figurative art and figuration, and I think because the visibility it brings to issues of representation is so important, so meaningful, powerful, relevant, and prevalent, that it's just critically important to both respond to it and maintain it in sight, in plain sight.
In film, I would say that there are three main areas of discussion, of conversation, where the issues of representation are being hammered out. There's behind the camera in the industry. There's on the screen, what we're seeing. There's in the audience, the discussion going on in the audience. And to a somewhat lesser degree, there's representation within the critical community. As a white critic in his 60s, I'm still the norm, and I know that one of the great things about the internet and social media is that it has promulgated so many good young critics of all different kinds. Just the diversity is astounding when you compare where things were 20 years ago. It's great. It's great to see. What I am seeing in the film industry behind the camera, there is some change going on. I know people of my generation aren't getting as many jobs as they used to because they are looking, especially on crews, for more diversity. Whether that's reflected in the top executive levels where the decisions get made about what stories get told, that still needs to change. It's changing very slowly. I'm cheered by the fact that the Motion Picture Academy took the Oscars So White, scandal of several years ago seriously, and it has been every year they induct several hundred new actors, directors, creative people, and they have been really trying to even out the gender differential, the ethnic differential, and they're having some success. And I think you're actually seeing that in the movies that are getting and performances that are getting nominated. So that's starting to change. It could be a lot more. And then the conversation going on in the audience, among the audiences, which is primarily through social media, Twitter being a particular, rage pit of opinion. But those arguments are getting hammered out in ways that I think would never have happened in a weird way with face-to-face conversations. The worst part of the internet is that you're not actually having a conversation with somebody who's in front of you, so you can say anything that you want. Yeah. Which does not lead to, polite conversation. Mm-hmm. One of the salutary effects in this case is that people are bringing up subjects that they would otherwise maybe feel too cowed to bring up in a face-to-face setting. And so you're having conversations about, I don't know, when Green Book comes out and wins an Oscar, and that's a problematic movie for a lot of people, myself included. And that conversation would not have happened 20 years ago and was front and center. And there was a lot of arguments on both sides, and that argument is necessary for us to start moving forward. And so there's all those different areas where there's progress being made. And a lot more needs to be made. But to me, the conversations are the most interesting part, because that's how you move things forward.
I think in the theater, I have to say, there's been such a clear articulation from, I feel it, from all aspects of the industry, from actors, from the writers, from producers, from staff, that we're not going to go back to business as usual. That was clear. And so then it was a question of how do we make this change? And you know, one of my personal learnings from the work we've done at ART, where we really went into a process as a full company, centering anti-racism and anti-oppression, and what was clear to me was this is not something you do and you get done. You know, it's not, and we worked with an amazing woman named Lisa Yancey, Yancey Consulting, that came and worked with us for 6 months at the ART, and we had deep dive discussions, and we organized breakouts in ways we've never worked as a theater, across diversity of positional power and race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, on all the topics of our theater, our budgets as moral documents, our values, our external investments, our culture of philanthropy, like taking all these issues and unpacking them. But what the major learning was, it's a lifelong shift. This is not something we're going to get done by putting our staff through one, implicit bias training.
It shouldn't be done that way.
No, right? I mean, would be great, but it doesn't work that way. And Lisa used to always say, if you were asking, "Are we done yet?" you're asking the wrong question. She used to always say, the question you should ask is, who do you want to be? I mean, you talked about that at ICA. Who do you want to be? Who does your institution want to be? And then it's mindful intention to that every day, and it's a work in progress. And you stumble, and you stretch, and you fall down again, and you get up. But if the commitment to center the values is there, that's what feels the most different to me. And that's easier to execute in a not-for-profit space where you are value-driven. I think doing shows on Broadway, I see the change happening. It is remarkable. The 2 shows that ART has on Broadway, we have directors of people and culture for each of those productions. All the crew, all the backstage staff, everybody went through breaking bias training. I mean, this never happened. But it's harder, I think, in a place like Broadway, because it's a capitalist thing, right? It's about ticket sales. But really leaning into the purpose of an institution and your mission, and having that hold your values being held so centrally to your purpose and your mission is possible and can be modeled, I think, at not-for-profit institutions. It's resources, though. I just want to underscore what you said, and very grateful, to the public's participation in that, and the government, and also audience and donors. That needs resourcing.
Yeah.
And it's as important.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know that the arts community has taken a huge financial hit as a result of this pandemic, as have so many different spaces, but I'm sure that doesn't necessarily...
So it's a hard moment, right? When you're saying, are we as robustly selling tickets the way we were? Understandably, people are anxious. I think the good news, and I just want to underscore it, because people are coming back. And I think we need to get that message out there, that if you do follow protocols, I think this was something we wanted to discuss, right? That there is, I think we all know this pandemic it's another one that's not like done, checkbox.
Yeah.
It's a different sense of how we hold public health. And yes, do we like to wear masks all the time? Maybe not. But if it's done out of a generosity of spirit, of a social contract with each other, and allows us to be together, in that spirit, we can find a way to be back together again, and be safe.
And joyful.
And joyful. Yeah. That's the other thing. I thought, early on, how is that going to be with an audience wearing masks? It's never going to work.
Yeah.
But I have not been in an audience that have been as excited as these audiences. Everybody's wearing masks. You look out at a sea at 600, 1,000 people, all you see is this. And the audiences are more alive than they've ever been. So it is possible, and we're teaching with masks, right, at Harvard University. I just came before this event, teaching a class on American speeches by our former president, Drew Faust, and I was working with students, coaching them how to deliver their speeches all through masks. But we could do it.
Yeah.
So I think we have to also encourage people that if the values are centered, if we're taking public health seriously, and we're pursuing it in a spirit of community and care for each other. And part of the care is actually the wellness of feeling alive again and feeling your heart beat and feeling your blood pump and being present. That is as important. We've learned this, right, from the studies of students who have not been in person school, what has been lost. So it's not a joke, this thing of being back in person together. It's not a choice. It's actually critical to our functioning and our flourishing. So I don't know, I got us off on a different topic. But I just want to say, I think there's a way for us to live with this and embrace it.
Yeah.
And it's kind of all intersectional.
Yeah, absolutely. And art plays a really big role in helping us get through challenging times. If we think of any really defining moment in our country or our world's history, we can always think of the art, be it music, be it film, be it, paintings, whatever it may be, plays that helped us interpret the time that we were going through, or even reflectively have helped us interpret that time. And we have another audience member question who's asking, and this audience member is asking, how can arts and culture be used to heal from the trauma of the pandemic? And the trauma, and that word trauma of the pandemic, and that phrase, there are lots of different facets because of all the things that we've been through. Yeah.
I think that's a tough question to answer. I'll just say, I think art does help heal. I don't think there is one answer to how the arts heal. Part of it, it does that in so many ways, from art therapy to being able to go with a friend to a museum or the theater or to a movie together, to being able to have like some social connections, to making art, to what we heard throughout the pandemic was the practice of writing, the practice of sketching, people keeping diaries, collaging, making their own films on iPhones. I mean, so part of it was the slowing down and paying attention and being able to center oneself, to feel gratitude. I think the arts do all that, but I think in the end, it is the shared experience that at one and the same time makes you look inward, open your heart, feel your humanity, see it represented on a stage or on a wall or in a book or a poem, and then as you are kind of in your soul, yourself, recognizes it, to understand that the work is then to bring it to the outer world to make the world a better place. And that kind, I think that is the healing that the arts can do when they're working.
In terms of film, I'm wary about prescriptive art. Okay, now we're going to make, we're going to have a genre of pandemic movies. I do think, I'm actually already starting to see some. There's a Netflix movie called Don't Look Up about a comet hitting Earth that clearly it was made, in 2020. It's clearly, using that as a metaphor for our political situation and our pandemic situation. It's not entirely successful. That's neither here nor there. But I think that when you set out, you have to find the right metaphor and you have to bury it in the right way, and it has to come out organically. I saw a Japanese film the other day by this wonderful filmmaker named Ryosuke Hamaguchi, that was made during the pandemic. The characters are all wearing masks. It's an incredibly emotional film, and the masks are part of it. To me, actually, there is actually one great pandemic-era film, and that's Bo Burnham's Inside, which was, not in theaters, but in streaming, but is an incredibly powerful film. It's probably going to be in my, year's best list. And I think we'll look back at it as something that just took a core sample of what it was like to be living in this time.
Yeah.
And there aren't many things like that.
Yeah.
So I'm wary of prescriptive, genre attempts.
Yeah. It's always better when it's more subtle, right? I kind of think about like Malcolm and Marie, for instance, which ran on Netflix. Yes. I'm like, so it wasn't set in the pandemic, but you knew that, or at least like I knew that they had a really small crew because of the pandemic. And I was just like, oh, what a metaphor. Like this couple is like in this house together bickering, and like they haven't necessarily been in that house for 20 months together, but I'm sure a lot of people can relate to this experience going through this pandemic.
It's the one with James McAvoy as well. There's a whole mini genre of people stuck in the house in the pandemic. There's like 5 movies. Yes. And is that grappling with the reality of the pandemic? Well, yes, it's grappling with one of our day-to-day realities. And it'll be interesting to see how, when this is, I'm not going to say when this is done, because it's not going to be done. It's going to be a new, normal, but how we represent that experience, which has really been a transformative societal experience in ways that, I don't think we've had since World War II.
Yeah. Or even, I think about Squid Game, too, which is a series, but there's this dystopian feeling to watching that, and like you see people who are like, they've been scraping and scrapping, and now they're fed up, and they're going into this really crazy scenario. But it almost is like, when you're watching it, you're like, God, I feel like like the stakes aren't that high, but we're also like all just trying to survive this thing and not like, I don't want to. I was going to say something that was going to be very graphic, but but not like, but not hurt each other too much.
Right.
So.
I want to go back to the theater because I think there is something about a difference between works of art that are going to speak to this experience, but there's something about the arts and again what you do. Because as I was listening to you, I thought, okay, yeah, you sit at home and watch we could see all these movies and all these, but that's different from actually coming to the theater. And there's an act of generosity in going to the theater, of showing up for someone else's story, and giving your attention to something else. And that you are, as an audience, that's why I'm very interested in that aspect of the theater, that your presence actually matters. So that you as an audience, you come and you're there, and you're actually there's a gift you're giving, and an artist gives, and that is healing. And if we can find a way to do that safely. That is a communal thing that I think is really important. And I think we've showed that if you can wear your mask and go to the theater, they're not super spreader events, right? So I think if we can live with that and then get back to this act of what it means to go to the theater and give yourself to something else and make something. That's what the theater is. The performer and an audience make something, because the theater, a little bit different from film and art.
Absolutely.
It actually exists in the space between. That's where it exists. It exists in this in-between imagination. So the fact that you actually can activate that part of who you are, which sometimes I feel like sitting at home watching Netflix is just coming at me, and it's coming at me. But there's something about so I'm interested in theater right now where that is actually put into relief.
What it makes me think about is all of the arts that ask you to put yourself in someone else's shoes. You see someone else's story, and if you're going to the theater or going to a museum where you have some agency, you are getting yourself there. You are actually investing yourself, right, making that investment. But in the act of encountering something. I think that's the word that comes to my mind that links a museum with live performances. That is an encounter. That is a live encounter. And in that moment, when you put yourself in somebody else's shoes, you are not alone. Right? And that is healing.
And I will say that there is an analog in the digital world, in the social media world, where, you know, we watch all these Netflix movies at home alone, but then go online to talk about them. Sure. And there is a commons, there's a digital commons where we have that conversation, but it is not close to the actual physical being in the same room. And I worry that that gets lost.
Yeah, and Diane, I think about, you know, a lot of the local theaters, including the ART, do these talkback sessions after a lot of productions. And I think the last one that I went to was the Barbershop Chronicles, and then there was a talkback, and it was really interesting. And I do audio description for visually impaired people for I've done it for the ART, and I think this play was at the Huntington, so oh my God, competitors, right? Like
No, it's all colleagues.
like the other theater that shall not be named, but it was called Hype Man, and it was taking a nugget from our racial reckoning and placing it in this musical group of 3 people. And
Which
so
we did as a digital film.
Right.
So
it's
it's all
in conjuncted together. That's right, exactly. So I as an audio describer, I had to watch this over and over and over again, and I'm like, I want to talk about this with somebody. Right. And it was so hard because it was such a solitary experience, but it was such a gripping piece of work.
Company one, yeah.
Yeah, but it's like, yes, exactly, thank you. But it's like, oh my God, nobody else is sitting here consuming this with me. But what I really appreciate about having those kind of forced communal experiences is you get people to have conversations who maybe ordinarily wouldn't be having them.
Right.
True.
And you get people in rooms together who, you know, they may live in 2 different parts of the city and would never cross paths. And something really magical happens when they're doing that, and specifically when they're doing that as a result of consuming art together.
And there is a social lubricant of being in the same room together where it doesn't turn into the firestorms of social media.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. I just want to give a note to the audience. We have about 5 minutes left. I was going to say if you have any burning questions, ask them, but please don't all ask your questions at once because they won't get answered. But I will pivot to this one audience question. Is there any aspect of virtual that you have found is better delivered in virtual format? And I'm going to tack on to that. Is there anything about Zoom production or all the things that come with this virtual world that we're in that you hope stays as we move forward?
I think for us, the ability to foster collaborative, creative encounters with artists through the Zoom is transformative. I mean, we maybe because we make these things, you know, theater's so collaborative. So there would be just, oh, well, we got to fly everybody in and have that meeting. It's like we don't even think about that anymore. We just have a Zoom meeting. And we have to stop all the travel. It's just too much. It's too much on the environment. So that's an eye-opener. And of course, there's a moment where you need to be present together, and that same thing happens in a room, in a creative process. But there's a lot that can be done. So I think it's defining what can be done on the Zoom, and do it on the Zoom, and then prioritizing what happens when you're together in a room. But cutting down on the travel, cutting down on the strain, on the atmosphere, in a regenerative practice aspect, I think that's a game changer.
Yeah.
And that's not going away.
I think it's the ability to have people participate from all over the world who we could never get to come to Boston for a 2-hour conversation like this is fantastic. To be able to make an invitation, have somebody Zoom in for a limited amount of time, and be able to bring just such exciting ideas to the fore is been fantastic. That has to stay. It's been additive, and I think, but extends us outward and brings more back to us. So,
I think the rise of streaming has just busted open the doors of how many stories can be told. Has brought in so many creative, creative people. You could argue that the major creative forces in Hollywood have moved from mainstream films to TV. But more to the point, I feel like it's altered the distribution mathematics in that a Avengers film would be seen in 10,000 movie theaters and everybody in America could see it. A art house film like, I don't know, Licorice Pizza, and that's actually a high profile one, would be seen by 10% of the country in small art house theaters and nowhere near a multiplex. Streaming changes that equation. It brings challenging fare to everybody. And in fact, you are seeing that reflected in who's watching, who's writing, who's talking about the films. That is, that to me at least counterbalances the loss of the theatrical experience in that these stories and the people in them, and the diversity of the people in them, the diversity of the stories being told is, Minari is a perfect example, last year's Minari, of a film that would have, won a couple of awards perhaps, but, would have still been seen by an absolute fraction of the movie-going public. And it's everywhere on streaming, and I don't know the numbers because they don't release the numbers, I wish they would. But it's been seen by a much, much, much larger percentage of people, and that's to the good.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sad to say that we have ran out of time, but there's so many, we could keep talking about this for a long time, and I know our audience online and in person has many more burning questions, so hopefully you all will stick around, at least the in-person audience can ask you a couple questions. And for those online, you can find these lovely people online, you can, tap into these different institutions and all that kind of stuff and keep the conversation going. So as we do reach the end, I want to thank the three of you so much. Let's give them a round of applause for coming out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. It's really been a pleasure. And because City Space is also back and thriving as not necessarily an art venue, but a community venue, I have to let you know that it is a busy week here at City Space. So please go to wbur.org/events to see what's coming up. Tomorrow, the lovely Tiziana Deering will interview Huma Abedin, I hope I got that correct, on her new memoir, Both/And. And on Thursday, Meghna Chakrabarty will be interviewing New York Times food critic Dory Greenspan. Those are two lovely people who you have to see work in person. Dory will be talking about her new cookbook, Baking with Dory, Sweet, Salty, and Spicy. And she's nothing but sweet. Well, yeah, I don't know her personally, but she has really good cookies. Yeah, she has great cookbooks, and I've heard her on the radio a number of times. So thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.